Right? Good evening. This is an event I originally hadn't planned on speaking at. As you know, this past August marked the actual 100th birthday of my family's beloved brother and uncle. In preparation, I had the privilege of bringing the family together and forming a centennial committee to work closely with our primary partners, Vintage Random House, as well as New York Public Library and the Schomburg Center where Uncle Jimmy's papers are kept. Indeed. In fact, one of the town hall organizers of tonight's event is a former Schomburg archivist. More signs of natural alignment among cultural purveyors. I should mention that the Schomburg exhibit closes at the end of the month, so please see it if you haven't done so. Also, quick shout out to a lot of the Baldwinites out here. A quick acknowledge, there's a lot, so I'm not gonna really name them all, but I do wanna acknowledge OG Charles Reese, who has a spoken word album, and he's been doing James Baldwin. I had a quick glimpse. I think Harriet Cole is here. She came in clutch for our family celebration, so I definitely appreciate that. That said, knowing that there would be countless celebrations of Uncle Jimmy's name, we as a family just wanted to have a visible enough presence to acknowledge and show our appreciation. However, tonight's event landed on our radar because both of the venue and the date. It served as an intersection of remembrance, bigger than praise for just one man. It was more of a holy remembrance of something sacred, a place where Uncle Jimmy actually stood and what he stood for. In many ways, tonight's anniversary is an anniversary of mourning, and not just because he killed Buckley on the stage of the debate. I hope his family is in attendance, but illustrating this morning, just 2 weeks after the famed March on Washington, America's first attempt at being post-racial, on September 15, 1963, there was a bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Alabama, resulting in the death of 4 black girls, ages ranging from 11 to 14. 5 days later, Uncle Jimmy stood on this stage. In a recent article published in the Boston Review, Baldwin historian Ed Plavlik wrote, and I'm somewhat paraphrasing, artists and writers for justice hosted a rally and a memorial for the slain children at the town hall on West 43rd Street in Manhattan. Baldwin took the stage to advocate for a national boycott of Christmas shopping and stated, all elective shopping should cease until the nation has earned the right to do so. Right now, the nation should be mourning. From a quote, from a moral point, there is something obscene about the way Christmas is handled anyways. Ruby D added to the audience, on Christmas morning, mothers and fathers will say to their children, Santa Claus did not come because bombers came to Birmingham. See, in American textbooks, they like to paint the March on Washington as a lasting kumbaya, but don't stress the critical non-theory connection of the violent response to that historic nonviolent gathering. Fast forward 2 years later to February 18th, 1965, brings us to this 60th anniversary of his debate with William Buckley Jr., known as the forefather of American conservatism. And now I don't want to steal the thunder from our esteemed panelists coming, but when that debate happened, it wasn't really the rumble in the jungle that we currently lives rent-free in our minds today. I know a lot of you probably watch the highlights on YouTube many times as like a Sports Center highlight reel, as we all do. But in actuality, it's something Uncle agreed to at the last minute, pardon me. It was part of a publicity run for the release of Another Country. The publisher's publicist, who probably went on to become a boxing promoter later in life, actually tried to get top conservatives from Congress to debate Uncle Jimmy. But surprisingly, nobody wanted that smoke. So they ended up with Buckley. Applause to him. This all unfolded in a matter of weeks. Now, we all know how it played out, but yet again, in the wake of victory or so-called progress, from beautiful speeches, murder struck again. 3 days after the debate, While still in London doing more publicity, Uncle Jimmy and his sister, my Aunt Gloria, had a free night, and I'm gonna let him describe it as he does in No Name in the Street. On this particular night, we were free, and we had decided to treat ourselves to a really fancy, friendly dinner. There we were, comma, at the table, comma, all dressed up, comma. We ordered everything, comma, and we were having a very nice time with each other, period. The waiter came, and he said there was a phone call for me, and Gloria rose to take it. She was very strange when she came back. She didn't say anything. My Aunt Gloria proceeded to tell Uncle Jimmy that Malcolm had been assassinated. While I applaud tonight's theme of returning to civic discourse, when it comes to the American dream being at the expense of Black people, this is not a debate. Unlike the beautiful opera we heard that was in the imagination, Buckley went on to ski in the whiteness of the Swiss Alps. He did not receive a call at his dinner that Barry Goldwater, George Wallace, or Strom Thurmond had been murdered. This is not a debate. After college, Buckley briefly worked for the CIA. Uncle Jimmy, who did not attend college, was targeted by Hoover's FBI. This is not a debate. All of my family's phones were tapped. Buckley's wasn't. This is not a debate. The history of the world has never been clearer than current times. We are living trapped in the history that Uncle Jimmy forewarned us about. This is not a debate. Banning books of human testimonials is wrong. This is not a debate. If you're raiding schools and separating families, then cruelty is the point. This is not a debate. Killing women and children by thousands is genocide. This is not a debate. Trying to strip indigenous Native Americans of American citizenship is morally wrong. This is not a debate. Black people have earned the title to this American deed because we're the only ones who were forcibly brought here. This is not a debate. Ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. This is not a debate. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. This is not a debate. What would Jimmy say today? As you can see, he already said it. That's why he's the greatest of all time. This is not a fucking debate.
And now, Edwidge Danticat.
This is not a debate. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Trevor, for contextualizing this evening and your uncle Jimmy for us, and thank you to your family for sharing him with all of us. My name is Edwidge Danticat. I'm a Baldwinite. And thank you all for coming this evening. Can we give another round of applause for the performers? And wow. That was such an extraordinary performance. And I can't help, as Trevor was saying, I can't help but be struck by how contemporary, how current it feels. Like this debate, not a debate, could have happened today. And I'm sure many of you are feeling it or living some of this. So we're fortunate to have a panel with us, this wonderful panel of scholars, each with an expertise in James Baldwin, and the pivotal debate that you saw a little bit of and that you also experienced the aftermath of in this opera. And they're all experts in the rich body of literature produced by Black writers in the African diaspora, but also specifically in James Baldwin. We will ask them to help us explore the American dream today, 60 years after this, the debate. I believe these panelists can, in a way, help bring, along with the way Trevor did, James Baldwin into this conversation, as much as also the tongue in the lash conjured his presence on the stage tonight. So allow me to introduce our esteemed guests. You've already met him, Dr. Frank Leon Roberts. He's a writer, activist, scholar, an award-winning political organizer, a professor of English and Black Studies at Amherst College. Dr. Roberts is an expert on the life and legacy of James Baldwin, who is the subject of his forthcoming book, James Baldwin's Critical Stages. Dr. Roberts. Dr. Brenda Greene is a professor of... Dr. Greene has a fan club in the house. Is a professor of English and founder and executive director emeritus of the Center for Black Literature at Medgar Evers College, CUNY. Dr. Greene has edited several books that include Resistance and Transformation, Conversation with Black Writers. She's also the host of the long-running weekly program, Writers on Writing, on WNYE, featuring writers of the African diaspora. Dr. Greene. Dr. Matt Brim is professor of queer studies at the College of Staten Island and the CUNY Graduate Center. All right. Staten Island is also in the house. He's the author of James Baldwin and the Queer Imagination and serves as associate editor for the James Baldwin Review. Dr. Brim. And Dr. Nicholas Buccola is the Dr. Jules L. Whitehill Professor of Humanism and Ethics at Claremont McKenna College. He's the award-winning author of The Fire Upon Us, which I saw for sale outside, James Baldwin, William F. Buckley, Jr., and the debate over race in America. Please. So tonight's discussion also includes a Q&A from our in-house and virtual audience. So you when you scan the QR code you see on the screen, you can submit your questions at any time. And once our discussion ends, we will respond to your submitted questions. So make sure they're good because they will be broadcast behind us for everyone to see. It's unlikely that we'll get to all of them, but we'll do our best. So I want to start by asking the panel. So the opera we just saw gave us a window into the state of the American dream in 1965. I mean, it seems like such a loaded question at this particular moment. What do you think James Baldwin, and Trevor gave us a little bit insight into this, but what do you think James Baldwin would say about the American dream today, right now? Whoever wants to.
Well, I'll start. Thank you. Thank you. As I thought about this, we are now at a time that really epitomizes the fact that we don't have the American dream as it should be envisioned in this country. When James Baldwin wrote The Fire Next Time in 1963, its relevance is really paramount today. We are in the midst of the fire next time. He said, if you don't change the nature of race relations in this country, there will be a fire next time, and we are there. When we see what is happening in our country, when we see the dismantling of democracy, when we see the attacks against DEI, when we see cultural wars. You know, I can go on and on. I don't know about you, but it's really, really hard to turn away from the news because we are in the midst of a fire, and we are in the midst of watching a spiraling towards a dictatorship, I would say, autocracy. We're watching empire building. I'm going to stop there because my colleagues, I'm sure, have much more to say. Thank you.
Well, first of all, can we hear me? Okay. I just want to say it's such a pleasure to be in the building with so many love warriors. I feel the energy, and that I'm still reeling off of the beauty of that chamber opera. So once again, just can we give a round of applause to Damian Sneed and Karen Chilton and the great Denise Graves Montgomery. Thank you for that question, dear sister. I think that James Baldwin would say that before we can talk about the current state of the American dream, we first have to talk about the current state of the American nation, right? Because the two are inextricably linked, obviously, and we can't talk about the aspirational dreams and how far we've come without really, as my dear sister just said, looking at the reality of the current political nightmare that we live in, you know? And so Baldwin believed, as my brother Nicholas and others will be able to say with much more eloquence than me, he believed that the American dream itself was a kind of mythology. He called it an American mythology that we have exalted to distract ourselves from doing the deeper work and the tougher work of telling the truth about who we are, right? And so if the American dream was always a mythology built on lies, I think Baldwin would say it makes sense that we've become in so many ways a nation of liars, which then makes so much more sense that we would elect the liar-in-chief as president, right? It actually all kind of makes sense. But what I also just want to say briefly is that I think that Baldwin would say, so if the American dream is a mythology based on lies, and if the nation has become a nation of liars, then perhaps we actually can find some dark hope in what happened on Election Day 2024. I think that's what Baldwin would say, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. You know, on Election Day 2024, when 175 million Americans voted for a reality TV star with 31 felony convictions, right? Let's just lay it plain, as its next commander-in-chief. There was one good thing that came out of that, and here it is. America finally told the truth, right? America told the truth. It told the truth about the way it feels about women. It told the truth about the way it feels about black folk. It told the truth about the way it feels about LGBTQ folk. America told the truth. And so I think that Baldwin would say, before we can say anything about the American dream, now that America has finally told the truth, and it was an ugly truth, but the truth nonetheless, what are we going to do about it? And I think the conversation starts there.
I was in the Schomburg archive today, and I was listening to Baldwin, some interviews with Baldwin, and there was an interview he did in 1964 with Barry Gray. And Barry Gray is right the night after the opening of Blues for Mr. Charlie. And Barry Gray, they're having this back and forth, and Barry Gray basically says to him, like, what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to do? And Baldwin says, you need to grow up. And I think when Brenda's comments brought to mind a paragraph in The Fire Next Time that's about the American dream. And in that paragraph, Baldwin says, I've met very few people who really want to be free. And very few of those were American. And so I think getting back to what Frank described, I mean, this idea of the mythology, right? That there's a lot of people who talk a lot about freedom, but they don't believe in freedom. And Baldwin says in that paragraph, he says, I might be accused of speaking in spiritual terms about things political, but underneath it all, wherever our political fights are, underneath it all, there are questions of soul, always. Who do we take ourselves to be? And in what ways are we lying to ourselves? And who do we want to be, and how do we get there?
I think Baldwin might want to say the name Sam Norquist tonight. Sam Norquist was a 24-year-old black trans man who was murdered in upstate New York a couple days ago. They found his body a couple days ago. In the if you watch the whole debate between Baldwin and Buckley, Baldwin talks about the bloody catalog of American history. And sadly, we can add Sam Norquist's name to that bloody catalog of Black Death, death for transgender people. I think Baldwin also might say, and this I think is the most difficult thing for me to think about, is that Baldwin, talking to Buckley, says that he has had to face and to know and to always really know what integration means. Integration for Baldwin was not a goal. Integration was a fact for Baldwin. And he said, look at me next to an African and you can see integration is a fact. And he said, my grandmother was not a rapist. And so Baldwin has had to live a life where integration is what he sees when he looks in the mirror. Now, that was true then, and that is true today. And I think the more difficult it is to believe in the system of reality that Frank was talking about when Americans tell the truth, the more distant and distinct our systems of reality are, the harder it becomes to think we are integrated across these differences. I don't want to feel integrated with the people who are killing Sam Norquist, with the people who are voting for Trump. And yet Baldwin would insist that we must. And so this, for me, is the difficult work that he would also insist that we do.
I just want to, in addition to that, I think that Baldwin was very, very skillful at using the personal and his observations about what he had gone through to make political statements. And I think that he would encourage people to tell their stories as much as they can, to talk about the experiences, and to do it in all communities. You know, to do it, to use the school, to do it from the churches, to do it with our elected officials. It is important that you recognize that you cannot leave politics behind. Politics is inextricably intertwined with the personal. And until you understand deeply my personal story, you're not going to have movement. And you mentioned the young man, the young queer man. His story needs to be told. And one of the things that writers do very well, Edwidge, is to use the pen to tell their stories, and they do it in fiction and in poetry. And that can be very, very powerful. And we have to find a way to do it in more public spaces and to have conversations where we are really, really understanding that we have a responsibility to be political and to tell our stories. That's part of our social responsibility.
Thank you. To the extent that we saw in the clip, and Buckley almost rebuffing Baldwin's effort at telling his personal story, like almost mocking the fact that he was taking his people's weight on his shoulders. Do we dare imagine what he would have to say today about the American dream?
Footnote, it's a little difficult to say when we have the distinguished Buckley scholar on the panel who obviously is the first person who should be answering this question. So I'm going to take the microphone and pass the microphone.
I don't want to be in that position. Oh, boy. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting, moment. I don't know if that's interesting is the right word. But, I mean, Buckley, in many ways, when Trump was rising, there were a lot of folks who were saying, oh, I wish we had conservatives like William F. Buckley who were sophisticated and actually took ideas seriously, and this guy is, you know, the opposite of an intellectual. Buckley could at least perform intellectualism. But, I mean, I went into the research for the book with a kind of that sense of Buckley in my mind of like, and I met a lot of people and talked to a lot of people when I was doing the research for the book who would loathe his politics but sort of admire something about his style. But I did the research, right, in the archive, and that really revealed to me that the substance, right, is not at all far from what we're seeing in a lot of the dismantling of democracy and these things that I think are, you know, we're seeing around us now. Buckley, in many ways, there is blood on his hands, right? And I think that's the conclusion I reach in the book, is that certainly from Baldwin's point of view, there's plenty of blood on Buckley's hands. And so, yeah. And so I think that, you know, so I think that Buckley's sense, I mean, I think if he were, you know, it's hard to say, right? But if he were here, I think that, I don't imagine his politics would have evolved much. But I think that part of what, you know, I think one of the really important things that juxtaposing Baldwin and Buckley does is that Buckley really he would get so angry when he was put in the same camp with the sort of rabid segregationists. He said, I'm not like them. I have no animus toward black folks. And that was really what he believes. I'm not a racist. You know, I'm not a racist. How could I be a racist? I want to help. And one of the words he uses a lot in the debate is concern. I have so much concern. I'm so concerned. And Baldwin, of course, has this kind of laser vision, which we see right through that bullshit, right? And that he's saying to Buckley, look, you can say all you want about how nice you want to be, that you want us to have equal rights to you when we're ready, all this stuff. And he says, but we know, in fact, that we're never going to be ready in your eyes. And we're more than ready. As he says, I am not an object of missionary charity. I'm not a ward of America. I built this country before you even got here. And so I think that's, I ended up talking about Baldwin instead of Buckley, but that's my thought.
Anyone else?
Actually, I want to point out at the end of this debate, the last thing that Buckley says is he threatens a race war. And I think he'd say that again today. And I think people would listen to him and be receptive today. And Baldwin, at the end of his debate, said that when people are not allowed to participate in the system, that wrecks the system. That is not the threat of a race war. But Buckley responds at the end of that by saying that white people will, to preserve what is important to them, to preserve their culture, their way of life, they will fight a race war, and they'll do it for themselves and for black people.
Yeah, what struck me about that debate is when he continued to say how complicated the Negro question was. And someone yelled out in the audience, you know, when he said, look at you. You've risen to this certain state. You know, you are here. You are the speaker. You know, you can go anywhere you want. People really do not recognize you as someone who symbolically does not have anything. And someone yelled out in the audience, why don't you give the Mississippians the right to vote? And Buckley responded, well, I think that we should really look at the number of white people who are voting and decrease the number of white people who are voting and raise the standards for all people who vote. So when I think about what would Buckley say now, I think he would be very, very much, just going back to the reality of where we are now, very supportive of the policies and the executive orders that are being put in place because they are being done in the name of, end quote, efficiency. He would see nothing wrong because it's a complicated situation. And it's complicated, and it's going to take time. So just give it time, and eventually you will get your due. But we can expect this to move very, very quickly. So he would have no problems, I think, of what he sees going on now. And having someone, you know, I took this quote that we heard recently from Trump: "He who saves his country does not violate any law. He who saves his country does not violate any law."
And I think that's from Napoleon. Right?
Yes. So he is in the process of trying to save his country. So guess what, people? Give him some time. It's going to come.
Yeah, I mean, I think all I can really, yes, round of applause for that. It's going to come. It's going to come. You know, all I would say is that William Buckley is a very familiar archetype in American history, right? In another context, Baldwin would have called him Mr. Charlie, right? Now, Mr. Charlie, when he originally, Baldwin uses that phrase, he's really talking about white liberals, but it could just as easily apply to a William Buckley. The legacy of William Buckley, of the conservative, well-meaning white American who wants to see beyond race, is the same legacy that we see today in Mitt Romney and Mitch McConnell and George Bush 1 and 2. And we see that there's a kind of dangerous innocence there. There's a moment in the opera where Baldwin says, you know, a freedom fighter just died, and Buckley says, well, the blood is not on my hand, right? And of course, Baldwin would say, and often does say in his writings, that it's innocence itself that constitutes the crime before you even do anything, right? The idea that you can divorce yourself from the more extremist elements of the very movement that you are attached to. There's a long and rich and perverse tradition of that in the United States. And so William Buckley would certainly be saying the same thing that he was saying back then, right? That this is a land of opportunity. And many of the conservatives continue to, both then and now, misunderstand the difference between opportunity and probability, right? So this may be a land of increased opportunity, right? But I have the opportunity to become an Olympic wrestler, I suppose, but the probability of that happening is a completely different matter. And so I think all of that represents the long legacy of William Buckley.
Thank you. So how we were talking about civil discourse, and Trevor gave us a little bit of framing from No Name on the Street, how this debate happened to come about. How likely is a debate like this to happen now? Like, would we?
Well, I mean, I think one of the, and this is actually part of the work that my organization attempts to do, one of the things that happened in the aftermath of the civil rights movement and the progressive social movements of the 70s, 60s and 70s, is there was this retreat from robust public conversation about matters related to race, right? And so that tradition is one of the things that really is lost on us, this idea that people of different sides can come together in the public square to duke it out is a lost tradition. So I'm not really sure, and it doesn't seem like it's coming back, except in progressive radical spaces, which is why we need to continue to protect and preserve progressive radical spaces, right? Which is why we need to continue to protect and preserve the arts, because these kind of conversations are only happening in the undercommons of theaters and university campuses and church basements and community centers. And that is precisely why this current attack that we see happening on those communities is so dangerous, right? Because those are really the only spaces in America where people are allowed to have robust conversations from so-called opposite sides in a civil manner.
Thank you. Yeah. I would definitely agree with that, and I also say I do think those conversations are happening now. I think that we're at a time when the community and people recognize that it would not be in a debate forum. It would be, how can we have deep conversations and develop strategies for how we move forward? And that's what's happening in the churches and in the schools. People are coming together. How can we build coalitions? Because struggle involves bringing the community together, bringing diverse voices together. How can we engage our youth? Our youth are very important to this movement. You know, the youth always lead a movement. And how can we engage our youth? What can we do on our college campuses? What can we do in our schools to encourage our youth to be more engaged in to understand civic liberties and civic engagement? So I think that it would not be in a debate forum, but the conversations are happening, and we are seeing much more when and we will continue to see much more. We see the protests that are happening. We are in the process of building a movement, another movement. It's going to be, I think, bigger than what we can imagine. And this, to me, is reminiscent of what we saw in the late 60s, you know, and then also what we saw in Black Lives Matter. But I think it's going to go beyond that, because the measures that are being taken are impacting people on so many levels, impacting all classes. And it's forcing people from different groups to come together. And you complicate that with banned books, with the censorship of the curriculum, with the dismantling, you know, departments of education. This is going to affect all of us in deep and personal ways. So I don't think we have a choice. It's here, it's coming. As I said, the fire is here.
I think one of the reasons that higher ed is under attack by this administration is because these debates actually do happen in classrooms around this country. And that doesn't mean in classrooms around this country, Baldwin is preached as the correct one and the winner. It means that the debate is reconstructed and had in those classrooms. And I think that the administration is not so afraid of DEI as they're afraid of actual debates being taught by people who have studied these things and by students who are eager to learn and talk with each other and struggle with each other. And they don't want that. They don't want students to come to their own opinion, which is what education helps them do, their own informed opinion. And so they want to squash the debate everywhere before it gets started in higher education. And the way they do that is they say that there's indoctrination happening. I teach at the College of Staten Island. My students could care less about agreeing with me at CSI. And I think CUNY students generally. And I think there might be a class divide between very elite schools where there's a lot of pressure anyway, and students might feel pressure to say the same thing. This is a guess because I don't teach in an elite school. But at a school that's open access like mine is, at a school that has students from around New York City as well as around the world, you get a lot of different opinions. And students like to share those opinions and hone their skills with each other in the classroom. And that's something that I think the Trump administration knows and wants to nip in the bud.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything my fellow panelists said. I think that, you know, I've been thinking a little, I've worked a lot on Frederick Douglass, and one of the things that one of the lessons from Frederick Douglass that I think is relevant to the question is, you know, Douglass in his autobiography is describing how angry he saw the man who claimed to own him as property was when he was learning to read, found out Douglass was learning to read. Douglass became determined to read, right? So all these things that we're seeing attacked right now, in some ways they provide, you know, at least part of a blueprint of what needs to happen, right? Because they're trying to shut things down, as my fellow panelists said, that they see as dangerous. Because right now, I mean, one of the things that strikes me about the debate, I don't think it was in the clip that we saw, is that Baldwin says, there's a line where he says, what concerns me most, and I'll paraphrase, he says, is basically the sort of breakdown of our ability to communicate with each other. And I think this deep anti-intellectualism that we're seeing overtake a significant part of American political culture, it's not new, like Frank said, it's a long tradition, but it seems ascendant right now. And I think part of what Baldwin would call on us to do is organize in every possible way, and including organizing, going to the question, organizing spaces where we can have serious conversations about ideas that matter, and how do we act on those ideas in the world. I love in the opera how they captured what I think of as one of Baldwin's central indictments of Buckley, which is he is not a serious man. He can perform seriousness all day long, and he did it for a long time on television, on the lecture circuit, everywhere else. But at the bottom, he is not a serious man, and we have serious problems, and we need serious people to address those problems.
One of the things also that come across in the opera is this notion of radical love, right? Man's love for his people, and I think that was captured so strongly in the song, and I always love this, Baldwin's definition of love. Love is a war, love is a growing up. What is the role, in your opinion, of this kind of radical love in Baldwin's oeuvre? I felt like that's what brought him to that space, like to say yes to that moment. It was yet another opportunity to advocate, to express like this passion. So what do you think is the role of love in Baldwin's oeuvre?
I mean, love is the core, right? We can't think about James Baldwin. We're thinking about his particular and unique definition of love as confrontation, right? That if I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things that you can't see. On the final pages of autobiographical notes from Notes of a Native Son, he famously says, "I love America more than any other country on the globe, which is precisely why I insist upon my right to criticize her perpetually." Right? So this distinction between a kind of a critical Baldwinian patriotism versus a kind of immature American nationalism sits at the center of Baldwin's political project, which is anchored around this idea of radical love. And Baldwin understood, much like my brother Cornel West says, that love, justice, social justice, is what love looks like in the public square, right? So it's important for us to reconceive love not as this sentimental thing, but as this thing that requires action, this thing that requires confrontation, and this thing that requires radical collaboration. Without that, there is no James Baldwin. That is the center, and which also means if we are to take up the call, right, what it means to be a sort of Baldwinian public intellectual or a Baldwinian artist or a Baldwinian activist in the 21st century, it is to say, I love my country because my people built it. Let's be clear. I'm one of these black folk who, much like Baldwin, I've never had a problem professing my love for my country because I'm professing my love for my grandmama. I'm professing my love for my grandfather. So it's a Baldwinian patriotism. It's not an uncritical nationalism. And so we have to be willing in this moment to say, in the very name of our love for American democracy, we have to call attention to these undemocratic times.
I mean, if you read Baldwin's fiction, there's a ton of love in that fiction. There's a ton of good sex in much of that fiction. And that counts. And Baldwin, because Baldwin was trying to figure out, not a kind of cheap sex, but Baldwin was trying to figure out in his fiction, I think we've talked mostly about his essays or the debate, he was trying to figure out how people can come together across lines, how that can happen. And how all the ways love could be expressed, where you would not expect it to be, or where it seems least likely. Baldwin had basically every kind of person having sex with every kind of person in his novels. And of course, I don't know if we take that literally, but I think what he was saying was that this is everybody's responsibility to try to reach across, to see where these possibilities for loving each other are. And the bed is one place, but the debate stage is another place, and the church is another place. All these are kind of erotic places in Audre Lorde's sense of this productive kind of frisson between people, and Baldwin was looking for that everywhere he could.
I think we might be able to sum it up is he was very, very determined and intentional about creating the beloved community. And when you talk about radical is getting at the core of what is needed in order to create that community. So it's a radical approach to doing that.
Matt got me thinking about Giovanni's room, which I taught last week. Maybe I think I think Matt's right on. I mean, thinking about Baldwin and that sort of his commitment to sensuality in the broadest sense, I think is really important in sort of in a lot of different ways politically. But I'll just go in a slightly different direction, which is connecting some of these comments about radical confrontation and this kind of radical empathy we see in Baldwin. That I think is on display in a debate that he had before the debate with Buckley, with one of Buckley's go-to guys on race, James Jackson Kilpatrick, who was the biography of Kilpatrick is called The Salesman for Segregation. This guy devoted his blood, sweat, and tears to defending segregation every chance he got. Baldwin debated him in 1962 on an NBC television program. And there's just a part of it that I think it seems like a moment where it's not, it's Baldwinian love really on display in this radical way, and that he's sitting there across the table from the segregationist. And they go back and forth, and Baldwin, mops the floor with him. And at the end of the debate, though, Baldwin has this kind of moment of radical empathy for this guy, James Jackson Kilpatrick. He said, "Mr. Kilpatrick, I want you to ask yourself, what is it that you're so afraid of? And you claim to be a conservative, but I want you to think a little more carefully about what it is you're really trying to conserve. You say it's, the Western civilization and the American Constitution. I don't see you acting on the teachings of Jesus Christ. I don't see you acting in defense of the ideas we see in something like the Declaration of Independence at their best." And he says, "I think what you're really afraid of, if I may offer a theory," and this goes back to something Brenda said earlier, is that the fact of liberation means that we are going to be free to tell our stories. We've had to watch you very carefully in order to survive, and we've seen it all. And now we're going to tell everybody. And then that's just a mic drop, right?
Well, we have to hold on to the mic a little bit longer. So soon we'll have the questions behind us, but I'd like us to close by imagining James Baldwin returning today and bestowing us, should we be so lucky, with a new version of the American dream. What do you imagine that would look like or might be?
So I think that James Baldwin's American dream would be based on something he used to always talk about, which was what he used to call the New Jerusalem. And the New Jerusalem, let's be clear, first of all, is not a reference to the Jerusalem in Israel. It comes from his roots as a preacher at the Fireside Pentecostal Assembly in Harlem. It comes, quite literally, it's a biblical reference from the book of Revelations, where the New Jerusalem is, of course, that place where all people go. In the end, to be fully free and to love each other beyond the limits of their prejudices. And I think that that was Baldwin's American dream, and it was his dream for humanity. But I think that he would also be saying, now is not the time to give up hope. I just want to create space to say that as we close out this conversation. Baldwin would be telling us, now is not the time to give up hope. Baldwin was deeply, yes, clap for that, just for yourselves. Baldwin was deeply inspired by the work of the Russian novelist Dostoevsky, who famously said that the darker the night, the brighter the stars. And what I think is important about this moment is that we are the stars, right? We are the stars. And let's be clear, I think if Baldwin were alive today and he were thinking about the American dream and he were thinking about what was next, after he got finished reading The Nation for Filth, he would step back and he would say, there's still time to create that New Jerusalem, and he would remind us that the magnitude of the backlash that's happening right now against us, and we know who the us is, we the black people, we the queer people, we the feminist women, we the revolutionary artists and intellectuals, the magnitude of the backlash is ultimately a reflection of a great deal of fear that these people have, and an acknowledgement of our power, right? That these people, absolutely, that the lunacy of it all, the ferocity, is ultimately a reflection of the power they see in us. And so I think Baldwin would be asking us, and I think his dream would be, why don't we begin to see the power in us that they see in us, right? I think that would be his dream, that one day, this gap between the people, that we would switch from the people in power to the power of the people. And the way that we would get to the power of the people is that the people have to recognize that the light inside of them is so bright that they are losing their fucking minds, right? So let's lean into that light and start the conversation there. If together we organize, together we mobilize, together we dream, Baldwin would tell us, then together we will win.
Everything, I agree, everything you said. But I would also add the importance of the past. Baldwin really believed that we cannot move forward until we deeply understand the past and what has happened to us as a people. One of the projects that he didn't complete was to do the story of a book of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Medgar Evers. And he just, it really touched him. It made a dramatic impact on him that these men within 5 years of each other were murdered. And it's important that we understand on whose shoulders we stand. And on a practical level, what are the structures that can be changed so that we can move beyond having a society that's really constructed by race? What structures can be put in place to ensure that we have more democracy? And as I thought about this, I said on a level, what can be done with our Supreme Court? You know, should that be expanded? What can be done with our Electoral College? What can be done with ensuring that diversity and equity and inclusion is included in all of our curriculum, that all voices are respected? How can we expand the narrative of the history of our country? You know, what can be done to ensure that we have climate, we address climate disaster, and we address the fact that we have refugees from climate. There's so many things that we can do. So on a practical level, we also need to look at how people have survived, and not survived, but thrived. You know, that the struggle is continuous, and we have to continue to move towards it.
I wish James Baldwin were here. But, I mean, he is here listening to you. He feels like he's here. I don't know what he would say, but Baldwin was a contrarian. Not a contrarian because he just liked to pick fights or to debate, but because he could see things otherwise that most people couldn't see. And the way he did that was he looked at his own experience and he drew on history. And so his contrarian point of view, I think at least today, would be, while it's so easy for us to think the American dream is dead, I think we could make that argument. I think his contrarian self, he said, I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive. I think his contrary idea is exactly what you've been saying, is that the American dream is not dead. It lives in us, that light you were talking about, the history that you're talking about, the work, the activism, the writing, the research. I think he would flip that question on its head, that claim on its head that the American dream is dead, and say maybe we're on the verge of stepping into it, stepping past a barrier that we haven't been past before.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, everything down the table. A lot of wisdom up here. So I think, yeah, thinking about Baldwin, I think that just imagining what that American dream would be, I think that for Baldwin, this kind of idea of, you know, he at one point says, I have this reckless idea that we can reimagine our identities in ways that don't rely on othering people in order to make ourselves feel safe. And so I think that Baldwin's American Dream is a radical inclusion that is animated by this idea of love we've been talking about. Frank quoted that line about Baldwin saying that if I love you, I have to make you conscious of what you can't see. And that line, I think, is so, it's central to Baldwin's understanding of what art is, but it's also, he writes this beautiful essay called The Creative Process, and it's about like sort of the ideal of the artist, but it's really about all of us as creators. We are creating each and every moment. And what we should be doing, Baldwin says, is creating a new consciousness in one another that will make us more free and make us live in more dignity. And so I think Baldwin's American Dream is that, and going back to what Matt said, it's a radically democratic project. I mean, Baldwin will always say, we have not yet realized the power we have as people. It is in our hands. We cannot assume otherwise. It is in our hands to change it, and as we change it, we should be animated by that spirit of love.
Thank you all. I think we will now look back for some of your questions. Okay. All right. Well, as you're thinking of them and typing them in, there we go. Why are there the little hands there? Like, the questions get graded. How can we address race when, as in the Baldwin-Buckley debate, figures like Buckley dismiss racial identity by reframing it, i.e. treating Baldwin as white, mirroring how today's white elites and media evade the conversation, perpetuating systemic silence and inequality? That sounds like a fellow professor.
It's a smart question because just to realize that Buckley refused to even talk to Baldwin as a black man in that debate, right? I think that's all I have to say about this question, but just that recognition that Buckley refused to engage Baldwin as a black man, part of his rhetorical device, but also I think he couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. He couldn't, in this debate with, 500 of the audience members there, he found that he couldn't actually look at this person across the debate stage from him and engage him as he is, as he was.
And then the expression, like I just love the eyes just bulging ever so wider at every utterance. Did you want?
Yeah. I mean, so we talked about these American mythologies, right? And Baldwin we see at least 3 recurring references in Baldwin's work of these mythologies. The first being that mythology of the American dream. The second being that mythology of the melting pot. And this is actually where Toni Morrison actually says it best. She says, the problem with the myth of the American melting pot is that black people have to be the pot, right? Black people have historically been the pot. That in order for all these different people to get in the pot and get together, there had to be a permanent underclass that was catching the fire of the cauldron, right? So that's the pot. And then the third one is the mythology of color blindness, right? And that with Baldwin, to answer the question as best as I can, Baldwin was certainly and is always shifting, encouraging us to shift from a politics of color blindness to a politics of color consciousness, right? Why is it necessary for you to erase my black body in order to see me? I want you to see all of me, including all this melanation, right? So it's not about color blindness, it's about color consciousness. And what that requires is for us to shift the conversation in such a way that says, no, we will not talk about race. We understand that we can be color conscious without being colorblind.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to that part of what we need here, I think, is education. The understanding, people really, many people do not have a clear understanding of critical race theory, which is a way of understanding how our system is constructed by race. And once you understand that, when you're talking with people, you have to provide them or give them opportunities to look at something from the lens of someone else. You know, to look at history and look at literature from the lens of the enslaved black person, from the lens of the Native American, from the lens of the Chinese who were discriminated against, from the lens of the Japanese who were interned. Put people in situations where they can see themselves, view themselves as what it means to be the other, and provide them with experiences where they look at the lens from other perspectives. And that has to be part of that civic discourse we have, or that engagement we have with our youth and in our communities, and in those spaces where we're having conversations about how we move forward.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit. I think, you know, on Matt's point, you know, Buckley's refusal to see Baldwin in quite a literal way is, I think, significant. And I think, you know, one of the things I think about a lot with the Buckley-Baldwin relationship is that Buckley and Baldwin met one more time in May 1965 here in New York to have a sort of television debate. And Baldwin, when he was reflecting on that encounter later, it was much more Buckley's night for a variety of reasons, but Baldwin said, you know, when I think about that night, what really caused me to lose that debate with Buckley, the second debate, was that I just shut down because he refused to listen, right? So he refuses to see me, he refuses to hear me. And Baldwin said, what I should have done is hit him over the head with my coffee cup, which was a joke, but also, I mean, he was, you know, this is his central indictment, right? Buckley refused to listen and just pretended like he was, you know, at this sort of view from this objective nowhere, right? That this is about the faith of our fathers in some sort of objective sense. So going to what Brenda said, you know, I mean, just denying really the history that brought them to that moment, right? And Baldwin is always reminding us history is present in everything we do. And Buckley is just trying to keep that history at bay, because to come to terms with that history, I was on a panel once with this brilliant colleague, and she said, Buckley refused to listen because his listening would be his undoing. Yes. And I was like, that's it, right there.
Yes. So today is also the blessed day that gave us Toni Morrison and Audre Lorde. It's their birthday. And Morrison, Baldwin, and Lorde are all renowned writers who knew the importance of reading. Today, literacy rates are struggling. What ways can we resist this rising tide of anti-intellectualism to continue the stories of these visionaries?
Okay. No, I've thought about this a lot. I was speaking with one of my colleagues who's teaching at Morehouse, and he said how students aren't reading books, right? And Dr. Hakeem Mahabudi, the poet and founder of Third World Press, talked about how we need a book culture. And I think that's idealistic. We do need a book culture. But the reality is people are not reading books. Our youth are not reading books. All of us who teach know that we can give a book in the classroom and our students are not reading it. So I would advocate that we need a reading culture, and we have to find different ways of engaging people in reading. And so that's reading art, reading text, reading essays. You bring that into the classroom. Your classroom has to move beyond the book. You know, the essays. You have to think creatively and outside of the box so that we have a reading culture, and people have to develop strategies for reading very, very deeply and exploring there are sites on the web where you can look at how information is really being distorted and misrepresented, where you get students to do that research. on how they can read more critically and read more deeply. We cannot escape the fact that this age of technology and what is happening with our youth and the fact that people are involved more in audiobooks and et cetera, is that things have changed. You know, I'm sure many of us grew up with having books around them all the time, you know, reading all the time. What do we do to move forward to change that nature or that practice of requiring books? Pull from books, pull the essays from books, pull the stories from books, but find creative ways for people to read more deeply and to read, as I said, music, read art, read popular culture, read everything.
I really agree with that, Brenda. I think one of the problems is that there are greater rewards for anti-intellectualism right now than for intellectualism. And the rewards are fast, they're cheap, but they're constant. They look like likes, they look like a cheap hit, they look like sending around a meme full of lies, but that gets a lot of likes. So there are lots of rewards for anti-intellectualism. The deep rewards, of course, come with intellectualism. And that's just a little bit slower. And so we haven't caught up to it yet, right? And intellectualism doesn't always provide the quick hit, the quick reward. And so I think if we were reading again, students are reading, and took a little bit of time to do that, they would sense the depth of that reward and appreciate it much more than the cheap reward of social media. But getting to the place where they're doing the reading is the trick.
But I mean, at the same time, we have like books being banned, so the power of the book is being acknowledged. Like, right, I have a picture book called Mama's Nightingale that was pulled from Darien, Connecticut, because it was said it's called Mama's Nightingale: A History of Separation and Immigration and Separation. It was pulled because the parent group thought it was promoting pro-open border policy. And this is a picture book. So they at the same time, like, they believe in the power of books, otherwise books would not be banned. So we can't give up on the book, I will say, because its power is being acknowledged on the other side as well. Yeah.
I definitely was not advocating giving up the power of the book. I'm just saying that we have to read books in different ways. We understand that we can require a book, but that doesn't mean the person's going to read it. So how do we engage students in other ways of reading the book? And pulling stories from the book and pulling essays, or giving students opportunity to do research around the themes of the books. No, I would definitely not say give up the book. And I said the concept of a book culture has to be expanded to a reading culture, because you can give people books, and if they're not reading, it's not going to do anything.
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
we
yeah,
definitely
I
have to
agree.
find ways
Yes,
to kind of
right.
make the book fun. Yes.
Really quickly, I mean, Baldwin also famously said that artists are here to disturb the peace, right? Artists are here to disturb the peace, and I think we can extend that proposition, though, that educators are also here to disturb the peace. There's a reason why I show up the way that I do, because I'm intentional about trying to disturb the peace. I think that the Black radical tradition is rooted in that practice. And so part of what we need to do is say no. Say no to the attacks on our knowledge production. Say no to the people who are banning our books. The book is banned, teach it anyway. Disturb the peace, right? And so I think part of the conversation has to be, at some point, courage has to come in this conversation. Very often on the left, we have these conversations and everything is discussed except courage. And at some point, you've got to be willing to disturb the peace, right? Also, just quickly to remember that entire fields of knowledge were produced and forged in the fire of social struggle. We wouldn't have black studies if it were not for the civil rights movement. We would not have women's studies if it were not for the women's rights movement. We would not have gender and sexuality and queer studies had it not been for the LGBT movement. And so, again, back to this question of what can we actually look forward to? I'd love to know what kind of knowledge production is going to come out of this moment. I'm looking forward to democracy studies as the next major that we're going to be seeing on American college campuses. Lastly, Baldwin also, and one of my favorite, Brother Nicholas talked about that great essay, The Creative Process. There's another great line in there, that if we knew ourselves better, we would damage ourselves less. If we just knew ourselves better, we would damage ourselves less. And one of the reasons that books, literature, conversations like this, and educators are so important is because they do the work of telling us about ourselves so that we can damage ourselves less. We are, as an educator, every educator is a harm reduction specialist, right? Because we are teaching people how to damage themselves less. Let's follow that tradition. That's all I gotta say.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, really quickly, I had to think about this recently because I was called into the principal's office in my kid's school, and that they wanted to talk to me about sharing my research, and I thought it was with elementary school kids, so I was thinking to myself, what could I say to a bunch of 8-year-olds about my research? And this is one of the things I was thinking about, like both this idea of harm reduction, but also empowerment, right? So thinking about, when I was thinking about what can I, think about, like, okay, if I talk to them about the 8-year-old James Baldwin, right? What do we know about James Baldwin? He tells us, right, that he's looking around and he's trying to figure out what's his handle, what's his lever, what's the what are the tools that he has, tools of resistance against this world that's telling him in 1,000 different ways that he doesn't matter. And the tool that he grabs, right, his weapon is language, right? And both as a reader and eventually as a writer, but as a reader, he says that books matter to me so much because they help me, they connect me across time and space to people who I would never meet, who are so far away from my circumstances, but they help me understand who I was and help me understand how to survive. And so I think with kids, they're thinking about the ways in which language is in so many different ways empowering. It can be empowering, it can be disempowering, but the ways in which we can claim language, not just our own language, but we can learn from the language of others. I think that message is so important. Just trying to, because kids they're dealing with language in all sorts of different ways. Like Brenda said, they're getting it in all these different ways, a lot of cheap ways, like Matt said. But how can they find meaning in language that will actually help them survive and flourish in the world?
I want to add, we at Medgar Evers College, we recently had the Democratic leader, Hakeem Jeffries, come and talk about his book, The ABCs of Democracy. And initially when I read it, I said, well, why is he writing a picture book, right? But of course that the ABCs Democracy is based on a speech he gave when he was first elected the House Minority Leader. And he has concepts that can be used in the classroom. Talk about the power of language. And so you have the ABCs, American values over democracy, taking those concepts, freedom over fascism, justice over judicial reach, knowledge over kangaroo courts. So that can be a whole lesson on civics and what the power of language is, and getting young people to invest in that and explore what does that mean on a deeper level. How do we enact that in order to understand democracy and civics in a more, how to be more informed about that?
I mean, and in a way, we're all going to have to be, like, we have some really brave educators on the front lines who are, some of them, like in some state, risking censure or risking losing their jobs for teaching certain books. We all have to, some of them have to become like maroons, right? This is, that goes to this question, creative ways that groups that are being targeted by the current administration can move towards solidarity in their resistance, like different kinds of marronage, right, is one way. So give us some survival skills, folks. Let's close up with that. Some creative ways we can move towards solidarity in our resistance.
there are many ways. We've talked about some of them. One of the things I've been thinking about is at NYU, they used to have something called media ecology. I think we need to come up with ways to really study the media very deeply, to incorporate that in our curriculum, in our classrooms. And I think that is one starting point for engaging people more and getting them more active and understanding how the media impacts the way they're learning, what they're learning, getting them to do that research. So the media ecology is one way. And again, I'm going to go back to bringing back civics in the classroom. That is essential. We cannot move forward. You know, I see people at the college level who don't know who their elected officials are. We're in a constitutional crisis now. People do not understand the differences between the executive, the legislative, and the Justice Department. If once they understood that, I think people would be much more less apathetic about saying, well, this doesn't affect me. So we have to have that at the forefront of what we do, finding ways to study media, finding ways to help people become more informed about their civic responsibility and understanding the nature of civic engagement.
So I think three things come to mind quickly. The first is just quite simply that unity does not mean uniformity. That we can be unified and not uniform in our approach, in our identity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Unity is not uniformity. Number two, I think back to the words of Toni Morrison, who of course famously told us that it is times like these are precisely when the artists go to work. So now is the time to go to work. In the same way I said I'm looking forward to democracy studies and fascism studies emerging as institutionalized fields of knowledge production, I'm looking forward to all of the work that this moment can produce. Work that we saw tonight. Work that we saw tonight. This is what Morrison means when she says that this is precisely the time when artists go to work. And then also just lastly, to remember that, you know, I know it sounds corny, your existence is resistance, but it really is true. To be clear, the powers that be depend on your exhaustion. And they thrive on your exhaustion. And as Audre Lorde famously said, we were never meant to survive in their white supremacist imagination. And so part of the most creative way you can resist is stay alive in this moment, stay well in this moment, love somebody in this moment, produce something that you love in this moment. These acts of joy are not superficial. They fly in the face of a culture that would deny it all to us. So the best thing that artists can do and people who are targeted in this moment can do is keep creating, keep disturbing the peace, and keep remembering that this is precisely when we are supposed to go to work. I hope that this second Trump administration gives birth to a renaissance of creative expression, particularly black creative expression, which is what we've done every single time we've been here before. I hope we do it again.
One of the things I think is inspiring, and this sounds like I'm saying the opposite of what you just said, Frank, but I'm not, is that we've seen many examples in history where even hopeless people resisted. Even hopeless people, people who knew they were going to die, people who held out no hope for themselves, they still resisted. And I think about these instances, and I find that makes me feel so much more responsible in my safety. If I cannot resist from a place of relative safety, but others could resist from a place of hopelessness and assured death, then I'm not doing my job. And I feel in solidarity with them because of that gift that they've given me.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I think that one of the terms that's been in my head a lot is a term a colleague in the psychology department taught me, learned helplessness. Like we're in I think a lot of people are in a state of kind of, I mean, that's part of the plan, right? That there's a feeling that there's so much happening that we feel helpless. But I think one of the ways to push back against that, and I think the question gets at this really beautifully, is just think in big ways, big organizing ways, and act in the ways you can there. But also, all of us have people in our lives who are targeted right now in a serious way. And thinking about ways in which we can, in small ways, let them know that we're here and that we can collaborate in ways to outsmart. These guys have a lot of power, but they're not all that smart. And so I think that we can collaborate conscientiously with each other and figure out ways, in our spaces, in our workplaces, on our campuses, in our communities, in our religious organizations, whatever it is. There are folks, who are specifically targeted right now in a real way, and always, but especially right now, there's a feeling of deep vulnerability for good reason. And so how can we work together to try to resist? I think that idea of collaborative, the question gets at, how can we collaborate with each other and use the tools that each of us has in order to help protect those around us?
Thank you. Yeah. You just stirred, listening to the comments just stirred something else. Like a colleague said to me, when students ask her, what do you want to, when she asked them, what do you want to do when you grow up? And they don't know. She said, find a cause. Find a cause. What is your cause going to be? Because if you go with understand the concept that we all have a purpose in life, if we have a cause, we're going to work towards that. So your life is not about finding a job, but finding a cause, finding your passion, and as John Lewis would say, making good trouble.
Thank you. Making good trouble. One of my, Nicholas was talking about collaboration, and you, Brenda, talked about the cause. One of my favorite Baldwin talks is he's in front of a group of university students in the 1960s in Santa Barbara, and he's saying, imagine that we're writing a novel together. And being a novelist, I was immediately drawn into that. And as you move through the talk, you realize that he's talking about creating a country together, throwing out old cliches and thinking new ideas and trying to really birth something out of imagination, which was what we saw tonight. Out of something that already exists, a beautiful work of art was created, and then we were able to have this wonderful conversation afterwards. So I want to thank all of you for your wonderful contributions. And our interpreters, thank you. And Donna and everyone here who made this possible, and all of you for coming. But don't leave yet. We have a special treat for you. The Chorale Le Chateau will close us off and send us home feeling inspired and uplifted. So thank you for coming, but wait for them. As we exit, they will come. Thank you.